There are serious, military academics which exist, and historians who would argue that we're already in World War III, and what can the West do? The answer is nothing. It's not possible to fight all those wars. So what do you have to do? You either pick one of them and you lose all the rest, which is crazy, or you come around the table. You sit around the table and you say, okay, who gets what?
Welcome to the Future of Gold in Cape Town, where we invited some of the most renowned thinkers in the financial markets to discuss macroeconomics, geopolitics, and all kinds of things related to precious metals. But before we start, I would like you to know that you have 20% discount on any transaction fees if you buy gold, silver, or platina at goldrepublic.com. See more in the description below. So here I am sitting with Michael Every, a global strategist at Rabobank. You're the first guest I'm interviewing in this 101 sessions within the Future of Gold series. We've already recorded 2 roundtable sessions in the past 2 days. And we're here in Cape Town, as you can see, this beautiful, marvelous background here in Sea Point. And as you can see, I am red, like the Red Sea, or like a crab, or whatever analogy you want to, a tomato for the Italians, I don't know. And I hope that by the end of the session, I'm not totally carbonized like the meat that is preparing right now on the barbecue. Today, first, welcome, Michael.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And it's a great pleasure to be here. I really enjoyed the session last night, although I have to give a slight piece of feedback. Everyone who's watching the other session, which everyone should, because it was a really good debate, I found it quite entertaining that you were introducing everybody else, giving like a 30-second spiel on who they were, and you got to me and you said, and this is Michael Every. And it took me all the way back to when I was just starting out in the industry, like 30 years ago. And I was in Japan for an event where I got a speaking slot quite early on in my career. And the person who was speaking before me had, I forget who it was now, they were a legend in Japan, and so the MC was introducing them like, here's Mr. X, and talking and gave his speech, and then after that, and here is Michael Every.
Sorry.
Here I am. No, it's fine. Just took me back to that.
Sorry, I think I missed a few things that would be, let's say, like the one sentence that just describes, let's say, people and based on what or for whom they worked before.
Sure.
And in your case, I thought that there wasn't something like as clear, and maybe you can tell me, because as understood, you also worked in actually the G7 meetings, or you were advising on some economic policies. You've also worked for the Bank of Canada, or not?
Royal Bank of Canada.
The Royal Bank of Canada.
The G20, not the G7.
The G20, yeah.
So again, I haven't worked for them. I've been asked to present to them.
Oh, okay.
Twice. So I've presented to them once, and actually got banned from presenting to them a second time, which I think is a bigger feather in my cap.
What happened?
They pulled the presentation just beforehand.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So you didn't present anything?
Not to that particular one, no.
Oh, okay.
But I think that's a bigger feather in the cap than the one where I got to present to them, to be honest. But the highlight of that first one was when the Fed asked me, and when you say the Fed, you're not talking to Powell, you're talking to people further down, actually listened to the whole presentation and then said, so what should we do? And I thought, that's exactly the right question. You shouldn't only be asking me, you should be asking lots of people, but that humbleness of approach and actually asking, what should we be doing? That's the target.
So, since we're already at it, I'm curious, what is your, let's say, the most defining moments in your career that actually led you to the Michael Every that we know, the Michael of every trade?
Oh, very nice.
I think Isabella always, she mentioned this before we actually started. She said there's something about Michael that I don't quite understand. He has this super smart intelligence where he just picks things from everywhere and he just synthesizes them in one thing. So
well, that's a nice way of putting it. Thank you. Everything, I guess. Well, I mean, if I was trying to write my own introduction, and I'm perfectly happy with what you've just done. I don't have any ego at all, honest. But I think I would say, the guy who keeps asking, what is GDP for? And that is very much a shtick that I'm using and have been using for a few years. And I think I was the first person to condense a very, very complex argument down to a simple bullet point, which forces you to then address a cascading stack of really complex questions. And if you can't do it, you haven't got the right answer. You have to just keep going and keep going and keep going. So that's part of it in terms of where I am now to come up with that. But what would be key highlights over the past 30 years? I would say, being honest, being in a very small group who didn't know each other at the time, and some of them did, I certainly didn't. You've seen The Big Short, right? Everyone's seen The Big Short. So I was the same age at the same time as one of the groups who's covered in The Big Short, who were doing their best to call the impending collapse of the US MBS market and economy and financial system. And I was doing it from the Royal Bank of Canada in London. And pointing out that we were heading for a Great Depression, a calamity that people couldn't get their heads around, etc., and was roundly ignored and didn't actually take any position on it myself. I was just, I was too young. So that was
so
one.
you were a trader within the Royal Bank?
No, I was
of
an
Canada,
analyst.
or?
I was a fixed income strategist. Okay. And it was obvious to me at that point, using all the methodology, which in hindsight we all now understand, that what was going to happen in the US was going to happen. Because I'd been living in Southeast Asia 10 years earlier, in 1997. Actually slightly less than 10 years earlier, because this was like 2003, 2004 that this became clear to me where we were heading. And so I'd seen the Asian financial crisis up close. And that really shocked me, obviously, because everything looked like it was going gangbusters and suddenly everything collapsed around you. And I applied exactly the same methodology as to what went wrong there to the US. And it's like, it's very obvious it was going to happen. So I didn't really get any plaudits for it, because I actually ended up quitting my job before it happened and just moving back to Asia and just, watching it all unfold from the swimming pool, watching television, thinking, I'm glad I dodged all those bullets. But I'd say that was a fairly good early call. And then after that, using an expanded methodology, I pointed out other things, such as, for example, that interest rates were not going to be able to go back up again. So year after year, you kept seeing the bond market pricing in that yields were going to rise, and it was very obvious they were going to be lower for longer. And a lot of other people gradually moved into that particular camp. But then alongside that, I realized it wasn't forever, and that you would eventually get a geopolitical breakdown. So it would either be a political breakdown internally, that the working class or the middle class in each country would be so furious and frustrated at the stagnation and financialization that we were, stuck in structurally post-GFC, that they would force a change. And of course, that's very hard to achieve. I was always aware of that it's very easy to distract people with bread and circuses, etc. Or if that didn't happen, that something geopolitical would revolving around China, because China was obviously going to rise in that environment and the US was going to continue to decline. And the central focus of my argument, and still is today to the people who haven't heard it and didn't keep up, was that the rules-based order, or the liberal world order, whatever you want to call it, with relatively neoliberal economics, with a lot of, how should we say, vested interests, making sure that liquidity flowed their way on the side, was predicated on US military power. And of course, if you had a system which deindustrialized the US and made its military-industrial complex weaker, and the one in China stronger, over time, the US couldn't be the military hegemon. And when it got to the point just before the end days where it realized, hang on, 5-10 years from now, we can see what's going to happen. We're going to lose a war to China somewhere. They would pivot hard and reinvent themselves and say, right, now we need to do something different. And they would break the rules-based order. And we published a paper on that I published one in 2016. And then we did a more detailed one in 2020, just arguing specifically that this was something that was going to be looming. And then last point, and then I'll shut up, also ahead of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I published a paper in January of 2022, basically saying the market is extremely underpricing the risk that something's going to happen, which will be transformative for various different aspects of the market, but for the global system too. So I think each one of those are pretty good calls. And there have been others nestled alongside that, which I think are nearly as good, but I don't want to bore everybody with them.
And I think that also brings us then to the concept of statecraft that you bring in basically all like most of your analysis, and that you've called yourself also being one of the main frameworks through which you also analyze what we see more in the realm of geoeconomics and geopolitics at large and just global markets. How would you describe this at best?
Sure. So, first of all, I'm really, really humble here. This is not anything I've come up with. The only thing I've come up with is calling it grand macro strategy, because it's no longer macro strategy. It's involving grand strategy, which is the historic tradition that kings and emperors, used to be taught, which is how do you manage your kingdom or your empire, which has to involve both politics/diplomacy and the economy/finance and the military. You couldn't only do one or two of them. If you didn't do all three, your kingdom or your empire didn't do very well. So it's grand macro strategy is what we need to look at. That's the only original part that I bring to it. But it's a very ancient concept of how do you ensure in a vicious zero-sum world where there are multi-dimensional intersecting and conflating conflicts going on, that you emerge to the fore. And in its simplest possible terms, that is not presuming that we live in a rules-based order, and it's not to presume that the answer to everything is because markets. I'm withering in my contempt of that. The market is incredibly important. I don't deny that. Markets need to play a key role in many areas. Absolutely accept that. But if you start from the premise that the market will solve all problems and resolves everything, and that you don't need to take any political action at any point, well, you're not going to be on the map for very long. Historically, you weren't, and in the future, you won't be either. So economic statecraft is one of the three branches of statecraft. You've got political statecraft, i.e. diplomacy, making treaties, etc., coercing people. You've got military statecraft, which I don't have to explain, but obviously has a whole different, set of rules to it. And you have the economy. And when you move into the sphere of economic statecraft, you get things happening which were very easy to predict. And I did. And again, it was very easy. You don't need any brain to see this. That one day you would have someone like President Trump raising tariffs, which he did. And you would have him saying to defense companies, for example, I want you to produce more stuff at a lower profit margin, rather than you make as few bespoke items as you like and really kill me on the profit margin, and your CEOs are very well paid and your shareholders are extremely happy, but actually the US doesn't have any product to put on the field of war where it's needed. And that makes no sense whatsoever when you might actually genuinely have to fight a war, as we're seeing in the background now, rather than living in a time of peace where it's just a boondoggle, for shareholders and for the executives. So I've given you a very long-winded answer, but I hope that's just one example about how this actually addresses the reality that we see around us.
Mm. And so because you talked about the markets and there's this inherited, let's say, relationship between statecraft and markets being kind of a reflection of what we see, and in many ways they kind of basically react on top of each other, right? I mean, if we look at now, for example, the reaction of what's happening now in Iran and the surge of oil prices, all those actors also take into account how markets react also into their policies and the reaction in the, let's say, quote unquote, real world.
Sure.
So how do you then approach those two, and which would you say are the most important assets that actually reflect that?
Well, the market itself becomes both a weapon and a target. There are so many examples of that throughout history, but if you just look at very recent ones, why did Trump move on Venezuela? Now, on one hand, it's because there was a lot of Iranian, Russian, and Chinese influence there, and lots of other nefarious goings-on, which I think will be revealed slowly over time. And it was seen as a national security threat. So that's one. You can put it in that camp. But the other one is that Venezuela, of course, is a key oil reserve currency. In fact, on some estimates, they have the largest proven reserves. And while they're not producing very much now, the potential, 5-10 years from now is impressive if you can turn that ship of state around. So by Trump going in, you remove a national security threat in your backyard, but you take a flow of oil headed to China primarily, and you put it back under US control. Now, does that mean China can't buy the oil? No, not necessarily. But it means that China understands that it needs to deal with the US from now on. the initial reaction when that happened was that oil prices go down, because the US is also doing that to try and encourage the prices lower, because you want low inflation in the US so you can get re-elected. And so if you have low inflation, you can cope with some inflation coming from high tariffs, which are necessary to reindustrialize, to rebuild your military industrial complex. But that was one on oil specifically. If we look at another one here today, very, very live example, on the date we're talking, on Monday, we've just seen European gas prices, TTF, leap around 50%, which is really a staggering one-day figure, because Qatar has announced that they're going to stop LNG production. So that's 21% of LNG supply suddenly taken offline.
Because some of the missiles hit one of their facilities or not?
They did, or they've come very close. Either way, they're just deciding for health and safety reasons they can't continue. So Europe, of course, relies, not directly, but indirectly, on those cargoes. And naturally, you get that squeeze. So the point I would make here is, that's obviously Iran saying to the world, look, if you're going to attack me, like you did Venezuela, and try and put me in the same camp under a US umbrella with a new regime, as you have in Venezuela, we can create a stink in the market sufficient to make you back off. So the market, therefore, of course, becomes a weapon. But everything has a counterbalance in a kind of market sense, even if it isn't a market. I was just arguing, just before we started this chat, that if you look at Europe, their reaction to the Trump move against Iran has been one of disdain or discomfort, depending on the government involved. None of them have offered fulsome praise for it, even if Iran is a real problem for them too, potentially. And some of them outright opposed it. Spain in particular has outright opposed it. And yet now that TTF, the European gas standard, has got to that level and could potentially keep moving higher, the geopolitical logic argues, is it better to be morally outraged by what they see as a breach of international law from Trump and not to get involved, and to see gas prices stay at that level as the US and Israel, the only two people attacking Iran at the moment, try and blow up missiles on the ground or in the air before they hit the Gulf countries and push gas prices higher? Is that the correct thing to do, both morally, economically, militarily, politically? Or do you use your expensive air force, which is getting a bit rusty because they don't use it very much. Europe is not the military power that it once was, but they have jets. Do you take those jets and do you use them in the Middle East to shoot down missiles coming in over Kuwait, for example, or over Qatar or Saudi Arabia? Or do you fly them over Iran alongside those of other countries and try and take out missiles on the ground before they can fly at a facility which will end up making you pay infinitely more for your gas? And so there's a cost to rearmament and to flying those planes, politically, economically, financially. But is it better off doing nothing and just watching gas prices go through the roof? So that's an example, therefore, you might have a geopolitical counterbalance coming in to help push the gas price down, but that's not operating within a market mechanism. It's physical violence, which is helping the market recalibrate itself. Do you see what I mean?
It is, and I think it's a perfect example of actually the answer I was trying to find here, is that there's this constant back and forth. And now that we're talking about Iran, I think it's so much obviously in the news, and we're recording this on the 2nd of March just to give a bit of context. And by the time maybe this is posted or published, some facts might be already outdated, but I think it's more here about also looking at the bigger picture. What I found striking, and no puns intended, is that
that's a good pun though, I have to say.
Sorry.
For this time of day, I think that's good value.
Is, if I understood correctly, Aramco had a refining facility hit, oil refining facility hit. This refinery, if I understood correctly, represents 8% of global oil supply. And this is a structural thing, and as I understood, it takes 10 to 12 years to actually build refining capabilities, and there's no political willingness either to do so. So we've just taken away at maybe roughly 10% of global oil production, and this is a structural. This is not some kind of peak, right? Like, how do you see this now affecting oil in this case?
So let me unpack that. So first of all, and again, by the time people are watching this, the news may have changed, fog of war, etc. From what I was reading today, It was a small fire at that refinery rather than a damage to it. It's back up again. It's running normally. It wasn't hit. Debris from an interception of an incoming missile caused a small fire. Now, there's a world of difference between I'm not being protected by the US and my refinery is taken out to my refinery is slightly damaged by the US protecting me. Those are two very, very different narratives, particularly when you end up with the oil still flowing. But what doesn't change is the math of what you were just saying there, that you've got a facility that, let's call it 10%. Okay, the precise figure eludes me because I'm not in the energy side of the business. But it's a staggeringly important facility. And clearly the US doesn't have enough interceptors to cover everything everywhere. Neither does Saudi Arabia, despite the fact that they were throwing hundreds of billions at vanity projects all over the country. And you have something which can affect permanent or semi-permanent structural change on the global economy with hardly anyone looking after it. And this speaks to the utopian idiocy of because markets. Now, and it's no coincidence to me that ideologically, and on the previous discussion that we were all having together in a larger group, I said so much of this is ideological, that how you think the economy or the political economy should be constructed domestically and internationally is, of course, a cognate of, a precursor to and a driver of and a result of altogether how you think the global economy will work, because the politics and the economy have to go together. So if you think everyone can just live around a campfire singing Kumbaya and just trading marshmallows together, like my marshmallow is slightly more marshmallowy than your marshmallow, then that's one way of looking at it. And it's no wonder that most free traders tend to be utopians, thinking that there's some kind of world order there, which allows us to all live together perfectly because markets. And I don't believe that from a free trade perspective, historically. If it did, we wouldn't have had wars over and over again. Equally, and again, contentiously, I don't believe it in terms of gold either. I don't think any particular commodity or form of money or anything is a guarantor that we all live in peace. I know the Middle East pretty well. I know other regions pretty well. It doesn't make any difference what payment system you're using. That can make things worse, but it definitely won't bring people together, not when you've got the kind of tensions that you have there on an underlying basis. So I think we need to be looking at how we structure things more realistically, and part of that very clearly is going to be you need better permanent defenses of facilities like that Saudi refinery or the Kuwaiti LNG plant or the 14 trains they have there. And alongside that, there will be a restructuring of defense relationships and the political economy, but it's not going to be utopian kumbaya. It's more likely to be, me against my brother, me and my brother against my cousin, me and my brother and my cousin against that family over there, all of us against, the other tribe from over the hill. That's the dynamic, which is as old as the hills. It runs through the Middle East like the name of the seaside resort through a stick of rock in terms of the candy that you buy by the seaside in the UK. And I think that's where we're heading to. And it's all about who's going to be on whose team going forward and who can provide security, literally to whom, within which you then have a different kind of trading relationship. And I think gold will play a role there, as will many other things, by the way. But that's the big, grand macro strategy. I wouldn't call it a debate because it's being played out violently. That's the game that we're seeing at the moment.
And so in this grand macro strategy, how do you see and analyze then the current events in Iran? The fact that Ayatollah Khomeini was then assassinated by a joint strike from the US and Israel and taken out. And now that we have the secondary order effects of Iran kind of saying, if you want me down, you will all go down with me, or as much as possible to damage. And what you also mentioned, the fact that the markets are kind of like a form of deterrence. How does this then play out also in perspective of Iran also being an ally of Russia and China, and let's put it this way, in a simplified way, part of this bloc?
Yeah, so part of the axis of resistance or something, which Iran, of course, uses for its own little coalition in the Middle East. That's a complicating factor. If Iran were just Iran, that would already be an issue given where it's sitting vis-a-vis global energy. You bring in North Korea, you bring in Russia, you bring in China, and things get even more complicated, because I was saying to people last week before the war started, just before it started, there's going to be a war. Look, I'm telling you, you can see all the stars are aligning. You can make a case that Trump's going to chicken out, taco, taco, taco. I don't think so. I think he's going in. And exactly as predicted,
and
he
why?
did. Sorry?
And why is that?
Well, let's address that in just 1 second.
Okay.
But answering your previous question. And I said, if he does go in, the effects are going to be not the way you're looking at them in markets, which is if he goes in, it's bad. If he doesn't go in, it's good. I said that's a completely naive way of looking at it. If Trump goes in, it can be very good in some outcomes. After volatility for 24, 48 hours, maybe a week, that can be a fantastic outcome, depending on how things go. Or it can be an absolute disaster of various different kinds. And if Trump doesn't go in, it's a disaster, but of a different kind. Because effectively the global hegemon, the US, who's supposed to prop up what's left of the rules-based order, or at least try and use its muscle to maintain control of certain regions, is showing it can't take on a third or a fourth-rate military power because it's afraid of markets. And in fact, just to take a minute to give another analogy, if we rewind just to 6 weeks ago, which seems a different world, Europe was freaking out about Greenland. Do you remember Greenland? When everyone was worrying about Greenland?
Different news cycle. Now I don't remember anymore.
Okay, yeah, exactly. Well, people maybe literally have forgotten about it, but I was surrounded by people talking about Greenland. And I kept saying that this is an issue, but it's not the issue you think it is. And I give it, maybe we'll talk about that one in a second. I said, but what Greenland does is demonstrate that Europe, which was the master of grand macro strategy for hundreds of years, the dominant global force, has been completely eclipsed by the US. And whereas in 1956, bit of history, you had the Suez Crisis, where post-World War II, the UK and France still like to think that they were global superpowers. They weren't. And they decided to invade Egypt after NASA nationalized the Suez Canal, which they saw as in their contrary to their national self-interest. So in they go to try and show, hey, look, we're still very big boys. And the US, without firing a bullet, basically causes a run on the franc and on sterling and forces them to go home, which was seen as a humiliating retreat by them. And they were no longer independent great powers. They were powers who worked with the US. So I said Greenland now basically makes Europe look like Egypt. They're the countries that can just be invaded and there's nothing you can do. There's no one you can look to save you. So that was true a few weeks ago. I said we've gone from 1956 to 2026, and in those 70 years, Europe's just gone down and down and down. That's where you are now. If the US can't act versus Iran because markets, or the legacy of because markets in terms of its lack of preparation, lack of industry, lack of a strategic petroleum reserve, whatever. If that's the case, Europe is still Egypt, but the contemporary US is the equivalent of the UK and France in 1956, and the market is the US of 1956. And if that's the case, some people would sigh and say, oh, good, well, markets still rule. I don't think you can actually look at it like that, because, again, the country with the massive arsenal of nuclear weapons and aircraft carriers, et cetera, isn't actually able to do what it needs to do to achieve the changes that it needs to make to maintain that preeminence industrially and militarily, which means it will fade over time. Now, maybe it will go out fighting like Iran is. Maybe, we'll go various different paths. None of them are peaceful or quiet or suggest that we're going to live in a happy kumbaya world toasting marshmallows around the campfire. And people listening to this, immediately you can see why gold springs to some people's minds. And yes, that's an interesting connection. I'm actually looking at the gold behind you when I'm saying it. But I think that connection should hopefully be clear by now. That the fact that Iran is linked to China, linked to Russia, linked to North Korea, means that everything is that much riskier. For example, let's say the US goes into Iran and it wins. So by the time some people are watching this, let's say it's all over. Iran's regime is changed. The Iranian army rises up against the Revolutionary Guards Council. You have a regime shift. It's not a democracy. It's not particularly pro-Western, but it's no longer what it was. Oil prices collapse, gas prices come back down, everyone's happy. China's on the back foot, Russia's on the back foot because they can't get weapons from this new Iranian government. What does China do? On one hand, the US can now coerce them over energy, like if you don't treat us equally with rare earths and other commodities, other supply chains, we can squeeze you with commodities coming out of the Middle East, coming out of Latin America, and then things are very difficult for you. Sure, they can do that. Or, not a forecast, I'm just looking at possible outcomes. China can turn around and say, well, how about if we escalate in East Asia in the window in which you need to rebuild the stockpiles of munitions and missile interceptors which you just used up in the Middle East? Because we can see where you're going to be a few years from now. And if you go there, you're going to the end game, which is really, the final chapter in this, which is the US and China deciding how and on what terms they're going to live alongside each other, and in what geographies and in what ways. So I don't think we're going to get there in a hurry, and I actually don't think that's what China would do in the short term, but it's a very, very significant tail risk.
This sounds a bit like an Orwellian view on how the world is then split in three dominating spheres of influence.
Three? Where's the three?
Well, here I'm omitting then let's say you have the East. You have I think in George Orwell's.
Okay, literally from 1984.
Yeah,
Sorry, okay,
exactly.
Sure.
But then you're describing it as a bipolar world instead of a tripolar world.
I think it will be largely bipolar, but there will be blurred edges, with
the non-aligned the Cold War dynamics.
Yeah, or people who float. I mean, like, where's Turkey going to sit within that, for example, it's got an incredibly large footprint already and is trying to expand it. Russia obviously is likely to sit with China at the moment, but there are constant whispers that, potentially, for example, if Iran were to flip, Russia has a stronger hand vis-a-vis China because it's only really Russia it can get oil from cheaply. And so that price may not be quite so cheap. But would the US then try and make a sweetheart deal with Russia and say, look, join our circle and completely encircle China from a commodity perspective, and we'll give you the best deal in the world? It's unlikely, but it's on the table as a possibility. And just the fact that you can look at these sliding door alternative futures gives you a set of, like a nested set of tables of where different assets would be trading. Like, where's the Russian ruble in one where it goes more and more deeply with China and is alienated from the West? Where does the Russian ruble trade in an environment in which, suddenly they get visa-free access to the US and everyone's going back and forth and they're building a bridge between Alaska and Siberia? These are staggeringly different worlds that we're talking about.
And so I want to jump back a bit on the Iran topic and just get your perspective on how do you think that this will then play out in terms of the Strait of Hormuz, who is basically now kind of in one way or another closed. Do you think this is just like the other times, previous times, something that is just temporary and just create some spikes in the markets, or is this here more structural? Or
it's not structural in terms of Hormuz being closed on an ongoing basis. That's just not feasible if we're going to have an industrial economy globally. So therefore, I think we can rule that out. What you can say is that the heuristic that we've used for Hormuz up until now, for like 47 years since the Iranian Revolution, doesn't apply anymore. Because during those 47 years, the regime in Iran never thought it was on the way out the door. So they knew that they would be annoying China, for example, who's, increasing their friend now. It wasn't so much back then, but very much now. And annoying others by blockading it or attempting to blockade it. And even during the 1988 tanker war between Iran and Iraq, where a lot of tankers were blown up and had to be escorted through by ships, they didn't feel they were going to lose control of the country. So there was still a limit to what they were prepared to do. But if they actually think they're on the way out, which is what the US says it wants, they're openly saying that. And it only makes sense for the US to get rid of them because they can't trust them. to say, yeah, we'll work with you now, not this regime. Theocratically, that's just never going to work. Theologically, that's never going to work. Therefore, at some point, the regime may feel, well, we're actually cooked. That's it, we're done. And then, yeah, on the way out the door, just to try and hang on by your fingernails, you make everything 10 times worse. And if you actually are right at that final moment, you blow up as much as you can on the way out to try and destabilize the world, hoping that somewhere you plant the seeds of a new revolution to come back. So that's the backdrop to it. But that doesn't mean that I'm predicting, $150 a barrel oil, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's a much more realpolitik heuristic to look to, which is how many missiles can Iran keep firing? Because it's the missiles primarily that are the problem, and drones, versus how many people are in the air or on the ground in various different forms in Iran, preventing them from flying or blowing them up. And it comes down to that real attrition on both sides. And the US argument is worrying in terms of how quickly their munitions are falling and how quickly the stock of interceptors is falling, which means the damage they take is that much more. But equally, with no transparency, there's a strong argument to be made that Iran might have used up 25% of its missile stock already, just in the first 2 days. So then, if they're going to keep this pace of firing up, this could be over by the weekend, in terms of they're not able to affect much more change. At which point then Hormuz can start to reopen, because they're very limited in what they can do from that. And again, this takes me back to what I was logically proposing will happen, which is I think it's in Europe's interest to say, let's speed this process up. Like if we're just going to sit back and say we're morally outraged, but it takes a month for it to happen, the economic damage from having TTF like another 50% higher for a month is phenomenal. It's much better, I would say, to compromise what you think about international law and to say we'll help blow these missiles up. And the more planes in the sky, GCC or European ones, and they're quite capable of doing it, helping, compresses the window within which those missiles can fly versus interceptors decline and munitions decline. Do you follow the logic?
Of course. And it also makes me think of what Marco Rubio said at the Munich Security Conference a month ago, was the rule-based order is just pretty much over the old one, and the new one is being reshaped, and it's a lot about, I think, around what the Trump administration has been made very clear since a year at least, is that the intent that they have is to just make America great again and just rewrite kind of the rules of the World Trade Order, that the old institutions are not of any use anymore. The UN is de facto useless.
It is.
And they come up with their own Board of Peace and all kinds of other things. And that might be a Trumpian approach to it, but it's very clear that it's fundamentally different than the past 70 years, and that America is trying to fortify itself on its corner of the world and picking its fights. But on the other hand, starting also, again, new things like we see in Iran now, and making things maybe in a more accelerated way more obvious of where we're headed. How would you then interpret then the intent of the US and its ambitions then on this matter?
Well, there's no mystery. They've been absolutely historically transparent in terms of what they want to do. If you read the National Defense Strategy and the National Security Strategy, for example, they tell you in bullet point form what they're going to do, and yet people read it and still don't understand it, which I find amazing. But it conforms like 99% to everything in previous years I'd predicted they would do, because most of it echoes past policy, either specifically within America or more generally other countries who have been in similar situations in the past, or just episodes in the past. For example, what did we have before the United Nations? Do you remember?
No.
The League of Nations. That was the precursor in the 20th century. And unfortunately, America didn't join at the time. They proposed it and then they didn't join. And then, just as we headed towards World War II, the countries that were in it that were behaving very badly, Nazi Germany, Italy, they just left. At which point there's no enforcement mechanism because you're not a member, we can't do anything to you. So the League of Nations was a farce. And we've had international leagues prior to that, mainly in Europe. None of them ever work. Eventually the power dynamic shifts and then the club doesn't work. And the UN's a beautiful concept, but obviously it's full of compromises and rather farcical elements. So the US is putting forward alternative structures which it thinks will work better for itself. Now, everyone's free to do the same. What do you think BRICS is? what's the Shanghai Cooperation Organization? These are all alternative architectures which different clusters of countries are putting forward, hoping that if you throw enough mud at the wall, some of it will stick. But only the largest clump of mud has got the best chance of actually sticking to that wall and becoming the next wall, which you actually build, the foundations up from. So I'm not saying the US will necessarily succeed. I don't think all of them will work. But I think the legacy ones definitely are. You can see the argument that they don't achieve anything. Like the UN says X, Y, Z, and what? The UN says, well, we want this war to stop in the Middle East. And what? It doesn't mean anything. We're moving to a world where the IMF says something like that, and everyone will say, and what? But the IMF, those three letters, you used to hear them all the time. Oh, the IMF says this. The IMF says that. They don't say very much anymore because they have very little power to affect anything for the larger economies, largely because they ripped up the rule book and did whatever they wanted after the GFC. So I think for me, that's what we're moving towards. And the best way to look forward is to look backwards. Just one more throwaway example. So when Trump was re-elected, I wrote a paper that came out that day, and I said, don't forget the Monroe Doctrine. Because, the US historically thought of real estate as infrastructure. Let's get Alaska, let's get this new state, let's get that new state. And I said, what makes you think that's over? Why is territory now completely fixed? If you feel that you need to expand your footprint and there are people who want to work with you, ideally, that can still change. What's to stop the US becoming a franchise again if it wants to and other people want to? And this seems to really offend some people. And I understand why, if you don't want to. I completely get that. But if people do, and there are other territories that might look at it, you have to be fluid in your thinking and understand that the world can change and that what you think is certain may not be so certain.
So it also makes me think of maybe I'm simplifying it, but every time there's new institutions or this new world order is emerging, there's always a conflict, and this conflict is sometimes brutal and takes the shape or the form of a world war or some type of war. And in many cases, von Clausewitz said that this war is not merely a political act, but a real political instrument that's where a continuation of political intercourse that is
by other means.
By other means, exactly.
Yeah.
So, in many ways, we could see already some types of war in more an amphibian manner, if it's cybersecurity, political, and in some form of diplomacy or in financially. What would be, let's say, the triggers or let's say the moments where you see, just like now what we're witnessing in Iran, for example, moments where you see, okay, this is clearly a World War III that we're actually entering?
That's a very contentious question because it depends how you're defining your terms. I mean, there are serious, military academics which exist and historians who would argue that we're already in World War III, and we will look back in the future and see that it began, with Russia-Ukraine, for example, as being one particular trigger, and then are we talking about 2014 or 2022, et cetera, et cetera? Or they might even say, no, it began during the GFC, and we weren't aware of that at the time. I'm sure there are going to be endless debates in the future over this. If so, it's a pretty mild World War III because it's terrible what's going on in Russia, Ukraine, for example. The wars we've had in the Middle East recently, terrible. But nothing compared to what World War II was. The scale is absolutely different. I hope that humanity has learned that lesson and that we're not going to have that mass industrialized year after year grinding war, which we are seeing between Russia and Ukraine on a lower scale, on that one particular terrible seam of geography there, terrible seam of blood and death. I see a lot of global rearmament, which of course has to be a precursor to that kind of thing. But in some countries, they're doing it very slowly. America's now talking about trying to spend $500 billion extra on defense next year, and reportedly they can't even come up with things to buy, realistically, with that kind of budget. China is, of course, rearming at a pre-World War II pace. So that's a different entity there. But I think you have to think more generally in terms of, are you just going to see, as I said, this giant set-piece battle, which I don't think is there, or do you recognize that the key players, US, China, they do understand what this clash of two different grand macro strategies is. And they do understand that where the geographies of that are contentious, for example, Russia, Ukraine, for example, in the Middle East, up until recently, for example, Latin America, that's where you will get the sparks flying. And so you can, and I did, literally draw a map in the past of, okay, here's where you can see Team A and Team B, or Team Red, Team Blue, are going to be contentious over which country or which parts of which country, and the resources within it are playing for which team. And that's more or less exactly what you've seen. So that's more of a rolling, lower level World War III, which is much more grey zone most of the time, much more economic warfare most of the time, but occasionally gets really extremely violent in bursts, which is, again, exactly what we're seeing in Iran now. It's exactly what we're seeing.
Well, some even speculate that now that there's so much fuss in the Middle East, that this might be also a great occasion for China to actually move on to Taiwan.
Well, that's what I was alluding to. And as I said, if that were to happen, then you do go to the end game, because the US is currently bogged down in the Middle East. They can't just leave that without abandoning that front. They need to deal with Iran in order to have all the energy there, as I said, under their umbrella, priced in US dollars, and with nice low energy prices, and with the ability that they can have low energy prices, not only because of domestic production, but because of the ensured flow for their allies. But China has a higher price, which is part of the economic warfare, that, at any point we can squeeze just enough that you pay more. It's what China does to the US. If you look at the price of rare earths and critical minerals in the US, they're X% or X times what they are in China. That's a deliberate strategy. I pay 1, you pay 5, or you pay 3. You go bankrupt trying to keep up with me. So that game is very, very clear. But if China were to say, right, fast forward, we're going to try and go for Taiwan, then it's a completely different scenario. And again, this is purely hypothetical. I'm not forecasting this in any way, shape or form. We don't know what would happen. We don't know if the US would have to acquiesce. But I think there's even a broader scenario than that. And it's one I painted out hypothetically in 2018. I said, what happens if, on a coordinated fashion, North Korea moves on South Korea, or moves all the troops up to the border? Russia moves on the Baltics. That's what I said then. I mean, Ukraine obviously has been the flashpoint already.
But why would Russia move into the Baltics if they already had so much problem to get to Ukraine?
Not completely, but this is in 2018, I'm saying it. Turkey moves on Greece. Again, just purely, pieces on a board, just playing a game. Iran blockades Hormuz, and China on Taiwan, all at the same time. What can the West do? Excuse me, I'm coughing in horror. What can the West do? The answer is nothing. It's not possible to fight all those wars. So what do you have to do? You either pick one of them and you lose all the rest, which is crazy, or you come around the table. You sit around the table and you say, okay, who gets what? And that's, again, a process that's already starting to happen. We're talking about Potsdam, Yalta. People are using that historical analogy. Ironically, Tehran was one of the meetings, Tehran, Potsdam, Yalta, at the end of World War II, about, where lines will be drawn. That's happening in the Middle East. Very much so, in terms of, new geographies and new boards of peace emerging, etc. Obviously, it's the case between Russia and Ukraine.
But pardon me, but I think the Russia-Ukraine conflict is a totally different one. It's almost incomparable to what we see in the Middle East and what we see in Taiwan. Because Russia has nuclear heads, and if you are about to enter a conflict with a nation state that is having just as much nuclear heads as the most powerful army in the world, which is the US still, it's a totally different war that you're playing here, because it's a war that we see in the Cold War, which is a war of total mutual annihilation.
Well, yeah, look, I agree with you to a degree, but again, it's a contentious issue where you have different views on it. So if we say Russia's the nuclear power, Ukraine isn't, because it gave them up, the only country really that's given them up and then suffered the consequences for it. But no one will ever do that again. Why hasn't it won? And the answer
Russia hasn't won?
Well, Russia has nuclear warheads, Ukraine doesn't, so Russia should have won. There are limitations to using them. So on one level, you can argue, and people do, and I think it makes sense, that they give you carte blanche. It's like, okay, I'm going to do whatever I want in the conventional field now, and you can't do anything to stop me past a certain point because I might nuke you. Yeah, I think that is starting to happen now. So rather than being defensive, they're a shield for offensive things. But at the same time, because they are still so taboo, no one wants to be the first to start using them again for that reason. They're also limiting to an extent. Like, for example, the UK, we're supposed to have a nuclear deterrent. We don't even know if it works anymore. France has one. And France today, just before we started talking, is announcing about extending it, that they'll now cover Greece and Poland with a nuclear umbrella. We could talk about that for an hour. Are they really going to do that? Is Paris going to basically say you can destroy me to save Athens? These are very contentious topics, and what's the quid pro quo if they do? But if you think, well, no, they're never going to do that, then you can just keep advancing. If you were to say, right, that's our target, we're going to coerce, advance, because no one actually wants to press that button because it's the end of it all. It still does limit you. So I agree with you that having a nuclear power there does make a difference. Like North Korea, for example, they have a weapon, and they may well be mad enough to use it, which means you can't react to North Korea the way that you can still react to Iran. It's one of the reasons why the US is doing it to Iran now, because if they ever cross that threshold, it changes the whole regional dynamic. They've lost that geography, effectively. That's it. You can't, that's blocked permanently. You have to go around it. That's one of the other reasons why they're acting now. They would probably have been far better off doing that with North Korea if they could have somehow in the past, but for whatever reason they didn't. Yeah.
We also didn't mention the conflict also that just emerged between Afghanistan and Pakistan.
And one of them's got nukes, and the other one doesn't. Obviously, Pakistan is far better armed than Afghanistan. But that just speaks to the broader thesis that I'm putting forward, which is that so much of the world, underneath what, again, we call this peaceful rules-based order, was far from rules-based, and there was very little order there. And that's just emerging in more and more locations. And once you start a conflagration in one area, it tends to spread. I don't know how this all plays out. No one does. The best educated people in all relevant fields will tell you can't predict it. But what's fairly easy to predict is that there will be volatility and quite likely chaos, and things will get a lot worse before they get better. But it's important to just not only say that, like the world's a bad, everyone's crazy, they're all bad, the world's a bad place. That's not very analytical. It's a comforting thing to say to you. You can do better than that. You can predict where certain tensions will arise. And myself and others have done exactly that. You can look in advance ahead and say, okay, this is likely to be the next flashpoint, logically. But you also have to have a construct that it sits within. And to pivot back to a point I've already addressed, but just to bring it up one more time. When Greenland was this big issue, lots of Europeans I was talking to, they were rightly offended. Of course they were. They didn't like the idea that they'd become Egypt in 1956. I completely understand that. But what I kept trying to explain to them was, you think this is you versus the US. The US is now predating on you, and you're being humiliated, which you are, and being coerced, which you are, yeah, to a degree. But it's only happening because this isn't about you versus the US. It's happening because it's about the US versus China, and you're not pulling your weight versus Russia. And Russia is the secondary field for China, or the second team, the B team. Europe is the B team to America. And America has continually kept saying to you, your B team needs to beat their B team. We're not going to help anymore. The A team is going to be taking on the A team, or at least trying to find a way to live alongside them. And Europe is continually saying, well, we're the A team while doing nothing. And so the American message was, slap, slap, slap. And I'm not saying they did the right thing, but the underlying message was Europe should have realized, no, it's not about us versus America. And if they had seen that dynamic, their reactions would have been less histrionic, like, well, we have to get ready to fight America. We have to decouple from American tech. Good luck. We have to decouple from American gas. Who are they going to be buying gas from right now when they can't buy it from Qatar? Russia?
Expensive American energy.
Exactly. Their lack of strategic options because of past choices becomes clear. But this would have been clear to European thinkers in terms of, again, what their reaction was and what they were putting their energies into, if they'd understood what the meta level is of this grand macro strategy, which is US versus China, and where the fault lines are, and they're one of them to an extent, and then what they bring to the table in terms of strengths and weaknesses, what they need to address and what they don't. And that would produce a very different set of outcomes to what Europe has been trying to do up until now.
And now talking about Europe, because let's say a secondary effect of what we've seen now with not just only the oil prices, but also, as you just mentioned, the gas prices. That's something that the spikes that we've seen now are maybe like half as big as they were maybe when Russia invaded Ukraine, and that the Europeans decided to stop consuming Russian energy, and then of course the Nord Stream blow up of the pipeline there. Europe is, as you just said, totally dependent on foreigners, or is not sovereign in a way that it conducts energy policy, maybe even monetary policy, but also defense. Do you see any way out for Europeans in this at all?
It depends what you mean by way out, because some Europeans make the very passionate argument that the energy transition will save them, and I think they're wrong, because the energy transition provides you with cheap electricity in certain countries at certain times, you know, like from renewables, but it doesn't provide you with the fossil fuels that run an army or key aspects of heavy industry. So you're always going to need both. And so if you're talking about total strategic autonomy, which is like this lovely catchphrase which Europe clings to, I don't see the way out, because geography is what it is. You have the resources that you do, and Europe does still actually have some resources there, but for political reasons they've chosen not to use them. But even they are finite. They don't have any oil, even if they have gas. So that's just a simple fact of life. But not every country gets everything that they want. The solution to that, if you think in terms of grand macro strategy rather than policy, and Europe is still thinking in terms of policy, which is completely different. It's one-dimensional or monodimensional and doesn't look at everything around it and doesn't try and join things up, whereas grand strategy has to. Like, for example, I always say you can't make a fist without doing this with all your fingers and your thumb. That's grand macro strategy. This is policy, and you can't fight like that. You just break your fingers. You have to fight like that.
You can fight like that.
No, actually, you can. Yeah, but if you've got a very simple economy. Yeah, no, I like it. You can, absolutely. Oh, yeah. But that's with a very simple economy, or it's a very simple policy.
You have to be very gifted and skilled to...
You do, absolutely.
Some karate moves.
You do. You're completely distracting me now.
Sorry.
No, not at all. But the point being that I think Europe's grand macro strategy choices are limited. And when you sit down and you look at, okay, what do we have? What don't we have? What do we bring to the table? Where are we really weak? In its totality, I keep telling people that Europe, on paper, whether it chooses to do this or not, is better off going with America, understanding that it has a secondary status to America. It is the B team, not the A team. But over time, it can muscle itself up to B+, maybe A- eventually, over a long-term program, albeit within guardrails that America will probably set, because that's just the way power works. And their role is to take on Russia and hold Russia back and help Ukraine within that particular sphere. But if Europe thinks we'll go with China, you know, which some people were histrionically saying after Greenland, well, we have to reassess. Really? So how does that work out vis-a-vis Russia? How does that work out vis-a-vis the US then becoming an enemy? Because if you think you were worried about the US maybe invading Greenland, when they weren't, but they were just trying to, you know, slap you and cajole you into spending money on another front, not just Ukraine, because there are multiple fronts. The Middle East is another one now, of course, right? What do you do if America actually wakes up every day and thinks, how do we screw Europe? You know, how do we bring Europe down? How do we use grand macro strategy against Europe? Which they don't, but which they could. And you'd have Russia doing the same thing, potentially, in the absolute worst case. And you'd have China doing the same thing in the worst case. Or you'd have the Middle East doing the same thing. What does Europe do then? If you're a fortress with very low walls and very few arms and no oil, surrounded by other powers looking at you like that. That's a terrifying scenario. So I don't think it makes any sense logically for Europe to do it. But they have to see grand macro strategy to make the rational choice within that particular framework.
Yeah, and we haven't even talked about inflation as well.
Inflation? Oh, yeah. Well, that's always fun. Inflation, look, a lot of my job was about inflation for a very long time, because that's what drives bond markets, that's what drives, lots of other things. But frankly, even though it's still really important, I said at the beginning, I like to think people will maybe, next time introduce me as the man who asks, what is GDP for? And that's why I brought it up, because it really just summarized so much of what I think I'm trying to do, planting those questions. And it's not about saying is CPI 2 or 2.1. That is important. You do need to have low, stable inflation. How you get there is ideological to a degree. Is it to adopt gold? Is it to adopt industrial strategy like China is and not gold? These debates are important. We had them to an extent yesterday. But it's not about that finite focus. It's more understanding that in general you need to have prices which are low and stable enough that people can afford to live well. And I think everyone would agree that. But we're looking at it in too narrow and technocratic a fashion at the moment. And we have a cohort of technocrats who think because they can turn around and say, well, technically core CPI is 1.9% at the moment, that the man in the street who's just extremely unhappy about everything going on around them is placated by that and goes home and thinks, it's all right, dear. They tell their wife, we're all good. Core CPI is 1.9. That's not how the world works.
And on top of that, combining the deadly mix of very low economic growth and output. So basically living in a total stagflationary environment.
Yeah, I mean, that's an extreme version, absolutely. But we've had what you could say is a dose of that in recent years. I mean, economic growth, I don't think has been particularly good in most places. It hasn't been very well distributed where we've had it. It's certainly not floating all boats. And clearly we have had a lot of inflation, and we still continue to have it in some pockets. And I think one of the other big disconnects between, politicians and technocrats and the man and woman in the street is that when they say we want low inflation, they mean they want prices to go back down. So, a loaf of bread used to be X, now it's 2X. When's it going to be X again? Whereas the politicians and the central bankers will tell you, well, it's 2X 0.00 at the moment, or 0.01 or 2. You should be happy that it's only going up slightly more than it was, rather than going back down to X. But of course, we all understand the difficulty in trying to get prices back down, politically, economically. But that's what a lot of people are looking for.
So I want to conclude maybe on what assets would then thrive the best, or not as, let's say, what you would recommend, because you don't give any,
I don't give advice like that.
Advice on that, but in general, as a, let's say, grand, let's say the grand asset strategy.
Grand asset strategy. So look, it's really complicated, and that's something I tell people. Within a macro strategy, there's always something you can say, buy this, buy that. It's really much more nuanced, because if you turn around and say, for example, defense, buy everything defense. Yeah, because that's going to be a key sector. But no, because that doesn't necessarily provide you much of a return. To give you an anecdote, I was in a private forum with with some military people, ex-military but very senior ones, a while back, and they were making the case that we need to see much more private capital coming into the defense sector, and there's a very productive way that can be done. I mean, America is doing incredible things with the Office for Strategic Capital and leveraging out 200 times to really use financialization to actually achieve militarization. So there are ways it can be done. But if you think of it in nuts and bolts terms, every time you're making a profit in the defense sector, that's a bullet you're not making. And wars are won with bullets, not profits. And so you will get the outcome I already mentioned earlier on, of Donald Trump turning around and saying to the executives, well, you can't do share buybacks, you're capped at $5 million a year, which is pretty good, but not a lot for these guys, until you actually make more stuff. So that's not good for shareholders, but it's good for USA Inc. And so it's harder and harder to look to a sector that you can say, well, logically X, Y, Z, because how markets work, whether they're going up, whether they're going down, is itself predicated on what the government needs to be achieving. So if we need to have this particular commodity priced at a level whereby we can make enough bullets to win the war, it's going to happen. Because if you don't, you lose the war, and in whatever form, you don't exist, whether it's total or just retreat and defeat. So therefore, things will be rearranged in order to get that outcome. Well, I'm getting a very appreciative feedback from the crowd over there. But that does make it really difficult to invest, because a traditional market allocation strategy, even if you think you're being geopolitical, doesn't account for the fact that no, the market is being told no, or yes, but the return is going to be this. So the only way you can think outside that is what might be an asset that trades completely freely aside from those controls. And that is a very political debate, because some people will say, well, clearly X, Y, or Z, that's always going to be a completely free market. Other people are going to turn around and say, well, no, there are historical examples where even that was put in a cage temporarily for a while because it was more important to achieve this particular goal. Is that clear? I mean, I don't know whether I'm getting my argument across.
No, absolutely. Yeah? Michael, the sun is down.
Yeah.
Our conversation is over,
Okay.
but I think there's going to be much more on the horizon to explore in the coming days. We will have also a dedicated session about what we talked about, but then in the grander scheme also what it means to commodities and also just the whole geopolitical game that we will discuss also with the other guests that are attending the future of gold here in Cape Town. To the viewers and listeners, thanks for watching this video. Please like and subscribe if you thought it was valuable. If you're listening to this on the podcast, please give us a rating. It's always helpful. And just before I forget, you also are having a discount if you purchase either gold, silver, or platina at goldrepublic.com by using the word interview1 to get 20% on transaction costs. Thanks a lot, and see you in other sessions of the Future of Gold.